the divided kingdom. This is lesson number 5. And last week we began to cover 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings chapter 10. And politically, 10 kings are covered in this passage, 5 in the kingdom of Judah and 5 in the kingdom of Israel. Now, the focus of the passage, however, is on spiritual matters. Remember, some of the kings did great military conquests that are mentioned in secular history that are not mentioned in the Bible at all. And so it's on spiritual matters. And the passage focuses especially on Elijah and Elisha. Now, great military exploits by the various kings, as I mentioned in secular history, are completely omitted by the Bible, but spiritual wickedness is brought to light. Remember, the arrival of a prophet means that something has broken down in the priestly system. Prophets were outside of the priest system. Now, I never thought about this very much until I was at Florida State and I was working on my PhD, and we had a class on Luke, and Luke deals a lot with priests in his writings. Luke Acts, he does. But John the Baptist shows up, and they made me aware that prophets always arose outside of the priest. If a priest became a prophet, he usually was an outsider from that point on. He may have been a priest, but he usually went outside of the priest to deliver his message. And I thought that was an interesting insight because the prophets are raised up by God to correct the system, okay? To correct the system. And generally, when a prophet comes, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. Now, this week we want to continue our study of 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings chapter 10, and we'll pick up with 1 Kings chapter 20. Last week we covered 12 through 19, and this time we'll pick up in 1 Kings chapter 20, which is an interlude to the Ahab-Elijah story. Ahab continues to be the main character, but Elijah is completely and noticeably absent. Now, there's an interesting tidbit here in chapter 20. In the 2 chapters where Elijah is absent from the Ahab story, Ahab is called by his royal title, king, in some form or another 16 times. But he's only called Ahab one time. So the king of Israel, the king of the nation of Israel, the king of the, it just goes on and on with the king, but it only says Ahab one time. All right? On the other hand, when Elijah is present, Ahab is called by his name 32 times and king only once. Now, why might that be? Now, I know we only have a few of us here tonight, but I'm throwing out a real question. Why, when Elijah is gone, is he referred to as the king or king of Israel overwhelmingly and only by Ahab one time? But when Elijah's present, he's called Ahab and he's only called king one time. So basically, king when Elijah's not present, Ahab when Elijah is. Why do y'all think that is? Throw out a wild guess, Catherine. What do you think? Okay. Yeah, okay. So prophets sometimes anoint kings and do those kind of things. That's possible, but what somebody suggests, and your answer is as good as anybody else's on this. What somebody suggested is that, or several somebodies, when Elijah's not around to show the spiritual condition of Ahab, he's cast in a better light. He's the king. There's no foil. There's no counterbalance to him. He's king of Israel. Of course he's king. We're going to call him king. But when Elijah shows up, who does Elijah represent? The king of the universe. So who's the real king when Elijah's on the scene? In Elijah, the king of the universe has shown up with a message for the little king of Israel. And so that's what they suggest, and that may be so. Whether this is the explanation or not, I'm not really sure. But it's something to think about. Interestingly, Ahab listens to a prophet 3 separate times in chapter 20. 3 times prophets come to him. In verse 13 through 15, in verse 22, and in verse 28. But guess what these prophets do in all of the cases? They bring good news. They bring good news. Now, Brother John talked about it this morning. One of the toughest jobs a pastor has is when he gets a phone call and he has to deliver bad news to a family. It used to, I don't know if y'all have ever seen We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, but it's the story of Vietnam soldiers going off to war, and several of them die. And to deliver the message to the families, do y'all know how they got the message to the families that their sons or husbands had died? They sent cab drivers with a telegram. And that was how they delivered it. So when a cab pulled up in front of your house and you knew you had not called for a cab, you knew what was coming. All right, so when a prophet pulls up, you know what's coming. But in this case, the prophets have good news. The prophet predicts and promises Ahab's victory in battle. But at the end of the chapter, another prophet shows up, and he gives Ahab bad news in verses 35 through 43. And that's a very good passage for you to kind of make a note of and go back and read when you have a chance, is verses 35 through 43 in chapter 20. The prophet disguises himself and waits for Ahab to pass by. He tricks the king into condemning himself for granting Ben-Hadad, the king of the Arameans, whom he had defeated in battle. He tricks the king into condemning himself for granting Ben-Hadad clemency. He was to have executed him, but he granted him life and mercy. So King Ahab was supposed to kill King Ben-Hadad, and he doesn't. He says, I'm going to spare your life. I'm going to show you mercy. So the Israelite king's sin is spelled out in verse 42. Look at chapter 20 of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 42. 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 42. And he said unto him, this is the prophet who had disguised himself, and he said unto him, thus saith the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand a man whom I appointed, God speaking through the prophets, I appointed to utter destruction, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people. That's pretty severe. That's pretty severe. All right, now, the sin was the violation of a Hebrew word, and it's got the guttural sound in it, so it's harem. All right, it's kerem. But it's Kherem. And this has that hard guttural sound where you just kind of growl when you're speaking it. This word's very important in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. I know you won't know the word, so you won't know the stories that it goes with, but how about this story? Achan. Y'all remember the story of Achan? They fight the Battle of Jericho. God says, don't take anything from the city. Destroy everything. And what did Achan do? He stole some stuff and buried it in his tent. That's right. That's right. Exactly what he did. But God said, when you come to Jericho, I want you to enact harem. I want you to enact utter destruction, as 1 Kings translates it. Okay? It means complete and total annihilation. What about Saul and the Amalekites? Saul was supposed to completely wipe them out, but he let the soldiers take some of the plunder from the Amalekites, and he didn't wipe them out the way he was supposed to. Now, Ahab's crime is not covetousness like Achan's, and it's not rationalization like Saul. When Saul was confronted, why didn't you wipe them out utterly like I told you to? Saul said, well, there were some really good animals in there, and there were some really good clothes, and there were some awesome weapons. So we thought we didn't want those, but we took the rest of them and we destroyed those. But those really good things, we kept. Because we figured God was a good God and God would want us to have these things. And he paid the ultimate price for it. But Ahab's crime is not covetousness. It's not rationalization. His crime is forgiveness and peacemaking. Wow. How is this a crime? Because God's command had been violated. Now, while we don't find the explicit command in 1 Kings, we know that God has set aside Ben-Hadad for destruction from verse 42. Ahab didn't say, wait a minute, you never told me I was supposed to utterly destroy him. He never argued with the prophet. So we know that he had the message, and he chose to ignore and disobey God's command. It's wrong to forgive someone when God has not forgiven them. And he set them aside for destruction. That sounds strange to our ears. Now, you had better be sure before you say, I'm not forgiving someone, that God is telling you not to forgive them. And I doubt very seriously you're ever going to encounter that situation. But if God set somebody aside for destruction, well, how did John put it over in 1 John? If I say unto you, if you see a man sinning a sin that is not unto death, that you can pray for it. But if you see a man sinning a sin unto death, I do not say that you should pray for it. All right? There's certain times that John says you just turn a person over to the devil. Paul even said, we're going to turn over this person to the devil for the destruction of his flesh, that his soul might be saved in the last day. All right? That's pretty hard words. Now, what is the sin unto death? We don't have time to get into it tonight, but there's certain things we can know about it. John said, if you see a brother, a fellow Christian, sinning a sin which is unto death, I do not say that you should pray for it. It's a sin that you can see. Otherwise, he wouldn't have told him, if you see a brother sinning a sin. All right, it's a sin you can see. What I believe it is not a particular sin like murder or lying or whatever the sin may be. It's not a particular sin. It is any sin that a person sins openly, publicly, and hard-heartedly against God's laws and causes harm to the name of Christ. If I go out and people see me on YouTube teaching and preaching, and I go out and I commit adultery, and I go out and I get drunk every night, and I go out and I get in fights, and I get back up here and teach again, and people say, that's the hypocrite that goes out and commits adultery and fights and drinks all the time. Why do I want to listen to him? And then Brother John gets up behind me and he lives the life he ought to live. What are they going to say about him? Well, if he's tied up with Jim, I don't want to listen to him either. Now neither one of us can get the gospel message out because I'm publicly sinning a hardened sin against God's commandments, and I'm now causing the cause of Christ to be hindered and damaged in the community. And I think that's when God will take a person out of the way many times so that the cause of Christ can move forward. But sometimes forgiveness and clemency is not issued and authorized by God for whatever reason. All right, so let's see what happens. Ahab violated what God had set forth, and he pays a terrible price. His life for the king's life. Somebody was going to die, either the king or Ahab. And Ahab said, I'm not killing him. God said, well, then I'm going to kill you and your people for his people. Now, as we move to chapter 21, we see a connection between chapter 20 and chapter 21, and that is Ahab's attitude. Ahab is sullen and resentful. Why? In chapter 20, it's due to this prophet's prediction. If you read the end of chapter 20, Ahab doesn't like getting the news that he's going to have to die and his people are going to have to pay a price for his sin. He's upset. I would be too. But in chapter 21, he's sullen and resentful. And why is he sullen and resentful there? Does anybody remember what happens in 1 Kings 21? He's coveting a vineyard. Naboth's vineyard. Does anybody remember the story of Naboth and his vineyard? Anyway, here's what happens. Naboth had a family farm. It had been in his family for generations. And the farm was very productive, and it was on a good piece of land, very attractive. Had to be, because Ahab was going by and said, I want that piece of property. So he went to Naboth and he tried to buy it from him, and Naboth said, it's not right for me to sell my family's farm at any price. And so you can't have it. And Ahab went home and stomped his feet and sucked his thumb and said, I'm upset, I'm mad. Jezebel said, why? He said, because mean old Naboth won't sell me his family farm. And she said, don't you worry about it, sweetheart. I'll take care of it. And she had 2 false witnesses come into the town square and tell the city that Naboth had blasphemed God. And what's the penalty for blasphemy? Stoned to death. And not only him, but his family had as well, so that his descendants could not claim the farm, the family vineyard. She wiped out all of his inheritors. And guess who got the vineyard? Well, Ahab got it, and he was happy, and he had everything he wanted. But there's a problem. When he got the vineyard, Elijah shows up. And remember what happens when the prophets show up. It's usually not a good thing. Look at 1 Kings 21, and we'll look at verse 20. All right, so let's see here. We'll go to verse 18. We'll just start at the beginning of Elijah's interaction here. So God's talking to Elijah, and he says, arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth. Notice what God says. He doesn't say he's in his vineyard. He says he's what? Naboth's vineyard. He had Naboth killed. He had taken over the vineyard. As far as Ahab was concerned, it was his vineyard. But as far as God was concerned, it was still Naboth's vineyard. Okay? He is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he is gone down to possess it. And you shall speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, have you killed and also taken possession? So you murdered and you stole. And you shall speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, in the place where the dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick your blood, even your very own blood. And Ahab said to Elijah, and this is where it gets interesting, have you found me, O my enemy? And he answered, I have found you, because you have sold yourself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and I will take away your posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pees against the wall. I'm not going to use the King James word there with some people sitting here. But it says anybody that goes to the bathroom against the wall. The King James has an old word there. Anybody that pees against the wall, I'll use that. And him that is shut up and left in Israel. And I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith you have provoked me to anger, and made Israel to sin. And of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, the dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. All right, so he says, if you've got anybody in your family old enough that can stand up and pee against the wall, they're done. And if you've got your wife, she's going to be eaten by dogs. And if you have done what you've done, you're going to have your blood licked by the dogs. So it's not a good thing for Elijah to show up. I wouldn't have invited Elijah to my birthday party. Okay, he gives a lot of bad news. So Ahab repents, and the prediction is delayed until the days of his son. But notice the lesson here. God's judgment may be delayed, but is never ultimately avoided. There is no escape from his judgment. It will happen either in this lifetime or in the eschatological judgments. Now, I want to share something with you very, very quickly. People that think they have time and people that think they'll get right one day may never have the opportunity. The Bible says, behold, now is the day of salvation. Behold, now, today is the day of salvation. All right? And so they think they'll escape. They think they'll be good enough when they stand before the judgment seat of Christ, or the great white throne judgment. They think they'll be able to get by, but you can't get by. Jesus is the only way to heaven. And if you don't have Christ as your Savior, there is no hope for time or eternity. I was witnessing to a young lady many years ago, and I was sharing with her the gospel, and as I was sharing the gospel, tears began to run down her face. And her chin began to tremble. And I asked her, I said, don't you want to accept Jesus as your Savior? Don't you want to settle this right now? And with tears running down her face and her chin just quivering, she said, not today. I'll do it later. Now, as far as I know, she never has accepted the Lord. As far as I know. She had every opportunity right then, but she thought she could get by for a little longer. There's no guarantee that God will ever deal with her again the way He dealt with her that day, because she understood exactly what was at stake. And she said, not today. She thought God's judgment would pass her over. God's judgment may be delayed, but it can't be avoided. Chapter 22 returns to the storyline of chapter 20 and the war with Aram, and once again Elijah is absent. And again, Ahab's actual name is used very sparingly, while King of Israel appears 17 times. So again, the writer of Kings seems to be up to something when Elijah is not present. Jehoshaphat, who is Judah's king, agrees to join forces with Ahab, Israel's king, but before he does, he wants to inquire of the Lord before he goes up to battle. And 400 false prophets say, hey, go up to battle. 2 thumbs up. Everything's all good. God spoke to us, and you have permission, and you have God's blessing. 400 people said it, 400 prophets. But Micaiah had a different message. Micaiah receives a vision from God. Look at chapter 22, verse 19. Chapter 22, verse 19. And he said, hear, Micaiah is doing the talking. He said, hear thou therefore the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who shall persuade Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said, in this way, and another said, on that way. And there came forth a spirit and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said unto him, how? And he said, I will go forward, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets. And he, the Lord, said, you shall persuade him and prevail also. Go now and do so. Isn't that a strange story? God's up in heaven. he's sitting around with his angels, and he says, hey, what's the plan for deceiving Ahab? And angels begin to give options to persuade him to do the wrong thing. And one finally says, I've got the answer. I'll go put a lying word in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, that's a good plan. Go do it. You're going to prevail. All right? Now, this brings up an interesting point. Does God actually deceive anyone? Well, before you do too much head shaking or too much nodding, let's look at Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 10. Jeremiah 4:10. And I thought this was an interesting study when I was doing this week. Jeremiah 4:10. Because it's not something we study very often, and so my memory had gotten fuzzy on it until I got to running cross references. And Jeremiah's talking in Jeremiah 4:10. All right? Jeremiah's talking in Jeremiah 4:10. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, surely you have greatly deceived this people and Jerusalem, saying, you shall have peace where the sword reaches unto the soul. What did Jeremiah say? God, you have deceived the Jews. All right? Look at Jeremiah 15:18. Jeremiah 15:18. Now that was just Jeremiah's opinion. Let's see here. Make sure I have, see if I got the right verse here. That's not what I'm looking for. Let's see. I got to see if I was in, 15, I'm in 14, no wonder. 15:18. That's not going to be the one I'm looking for either, I don't think. Let me see, 15. Nope. I'm going to go to the next verse, and I'll see if I can come back and find that. Look at Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 7. Sometimes when you're typing, you hit the wrong number on your keyboard, and the bad thing is when you do it, it's hard to figure out exactly where you went wrong. But Jeremiah 20, verse 7, I got this one right. Jeremiah 20, verse 7. O Lord, you have deceived me. Jeremiah 20, verse 7. O Lord, you have deceived me, and I was deceived. You are stronger than I am, and has prevailed. I'm in derision daily. Everyone mocks me. All right? Sounds pretty strong, doesn't it? Jeremiah says twice in 4:10 and 20, verse 7, Lord, you deceived Israel, and Lord, you deceived me. So Jeremiah accuses God of deception twice. But it looks like it's just Jeremiah's feelings, right? Potentially. Jeremiah said, Lord, you did this in 4:10, and he says, Lord, you did this in 20, verse 7. Now look at 2 Thessalonians 2:11. 2 Thessalonians 2:11 over in the New Testament. God's the same today, yesterday. God's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if we look at the New Testament, we'll find out whether God deceives people. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie, that they might all be damned. What? Who believe not the truth, but have pleasure in unrighteousness. There's the answer. There's the answer. God did send them a delusion so they would believe a lie, that they would be damned. But why did he do it? Because they didn't believe the truth when they had the opportunity. Okay? They didn't believe, so they were misled and deceived. They received the just wages of their decisions. Brother John preached on it this morning. Big decisions take care of a lot of little decisions. Big decisions take care of a lot of little decisions. And when you choose to reject the gospel, that takes care of a lot of things after that for the bad. And God has the right to give you what you have earned. Sadie, do you do chores around the house? Your mama says no. Do you do chores sometimes? Do you get paid for it ever? Never get paid for it? Okay. If you did do them, would you want to get paid? Like if you washed the clothes or put up the dishes or took out the trash. If you did that, you'd say, Mama, I'll do it for $1. And your mama says, okay, you can do it for $1. And you go up and you put up the dishes. Wouldn't you go to your mama to get your $1? That'd be fair, wouldn't it? And she'd owe it to you, right? The Bible says the wages of sin is death. And the wages of foolishness is judgment, if you read the Bible. So this is just like Sadie saying, I'll do it for $1, doing it, and then expecting her $1. They are not accepting the gospel and believing the truth, and they earn a wage, and it's judgment. It's fair. God is not being unfair. So what is the meaning then of such passages? The meaning of the passage is you can cross God's deadline. Look at back over in 1 Kings chapter 22. Back over in 1 Kings 22. And look at verse 23. 1 Kings 22 and verse 23. And notice what it says. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets, and the Lord has spoken evil concerning you. All right, so Micaiah is telling the truth. He's saying, look, all these 400 prophets are telling a lie, and they're doing it because God has allowed a false spirit to come unto them and believe a lie. Verse 24, but Zedekiah the son of Chenaanah went near and smote Micaiah on the cheek and said, which way went the Spirit of the Lord from me to speak unto you? In other words, did God leave me and go speak to you? Did God leave 400 prophets just to speak to you? You think you're a big deal. And Micaiah said, behold, you shall see in that day when you shall go into an inner chamber to hide yourself. And the king of Israel said, take Micaiah and carry him back into Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, thus saith the king, not thus saith the Lord. Thus saith the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him with the bread of affliction and with water of affliction until I come in peace. And Micaiah said, if you return at all in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, listen, O people, every one of you. So he says, let the people judge. If the king comes back in peace in any shape, form, or fashion, I'm a liar. And the 400 prophets are the prophets of the Lord. But if he doesn't come back in peace, I'm the prophet of the Lord, and the 400 are liars. You judge. Now 2 Kings chapter 1 follows upon the heels of, and by the way, Ahab dies in battle, but it was due to his own hard-heartedness and sinfulness. So 2 Kings 1 follows upon the heels of this event, and it is the famous story of fire coming down from heaven to kill two companies of men who come to arrest Elijah. Elijah's up on the hilltop. What do the two companies of 50 soldiers say? The commander comes with 50 soldiers, and he comes to Elijah, and he says what? Does anybody remember? The king has commanded you to come with us, in effect, is what he said. All right? Let's see here. Let's see if I can find it right here. O man of, verse 14, O man of God, thus hath the king said, come down quickly. So they're commanding Elijah. They admit he's a man of God, but they put the king's command over God's directive, and they say, you come with us and get down here right now. Okay? So, he comes to Elijah. He runs his big mouth. Fire comes down from heaven and kills him and his 50 men. The second one comes. He didn't learn his lesson. He says exactly the same thing. Fire comes down from heaven, kills him and all 50 of his men. That's 102 men dead right there. The third one comes, and what does he say? He says to him in verse 13, O man of God, he fell on his knees first of all. He said, O man of God, same as the other ones, I pray you let my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. All right? And the angel of the Lord said, go down with him and be not afraid of him. He went up to him and called him the man of God and said, hey, don't kill me. I'm just the messenger. I'm coming to get you, but spare me. Don't take my life and the life of my soldiers. Okay? So humility is the key to the passage. Now, the last scene involving Elijah is in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 18, and this is where Elisha is accompanying him, and where Elisha receives a double portion of Elijah's spirit. All right? Now, in 2 Kings 2:22, 2 Kings 2:22, we have an interesting story. So the waters were healed unto this day according to the word of Elisha which he spake. And he went up from there into Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head. And he turned back and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tore 42 children of them to pieces. I have felt like Elisha before, by the way, in this circumstance, where you got people causing problems, and you just want to say, Lord, don't you have 2 more bears to spare? I have felt that way. But this is really a strange story with all humor set aside. It says little children in my version. Does y'all's Bible have little children? Small boys, okay. This Hebrew word, young boys or small boys, can mean a male anywhere from the age of 12 all the way up to 30. And I've got several verses where it's used, same word, used of men up to 30 years of age. But no matter how old they were mocking Elisha as a prophet. And what were they teasing him? When they said, go up, you bald head, does anybody know what they were actually saying? Yeah, that's one way of taking it, and that's probably a touch of it. But what they were doing is when they say go up, they're saying, why don't you just go up like Elijah? You say Elijah went up in a chariot of fire. You say God took him home. You say that his mantle fell on you. You say you're his successor. Well, if that's true, why don't you just go on up like Elijah? That's what they were doing. They were teasing him, taunting him, saying, old man, bald head, or a prophet that had his hair cut in a special way, why don't you do what Elijah did? All right? So they were very conscious and knowledgeable of what they were saying. So they had to be old enough to do that. So I think you're probably dealing with young teenagers in this passage, and they're repeating what they've heard at home, and they are killed for taunting a man of God when they knew better. All right, finally, let's do this. Let's consider the Elijah-Elisha connection to John the Baptist and Jesus. Firstly, it should be noted that John the Baptist is connected to Elijah. Now, we don't have time to turn, but Matthew 11:14 and Matthew 17:10, Jesus says, who the people say I am, and some say that you're Elijah the prophet, and some say that John the Baptist is Elijah. Okay? All right, so John the Baptist is connected to Elijah in Matthew 11:14 and 17:10. Secondly, Elijah is mentioned several times in the New Testament. But how many times is Elisha mentioned in the New Testament? Elijah is mentioned several times. Elisha's only mentioned once, and it's in passing. All right? Fourthly, there are connections between the miracles of Elisha and the miracles of Jesus. The miracles that Jesus did are very similar to the miracles of Elisha. So what are we to conclude from this? Where Elijah and John the Baptist are connected, Elijah's mentioned several times, and Elisha's only mentioned once, but Jesus does the miracles of Elisha, are very similar to it. If John the Baptist is the Elijah figure, then Jesus comes after John the Baptist, just like Elisha comes after Elijah. And Elisha worked more miracles than Elijah, and Jesus worked far more miracles, if John the Baptist worked any at all, worked far more miracles than John the Baptist. And Jesus would be like Elisha coming after Elijah. And I think if we're to study the Elisha-Jesus connection, it would be an interesting study. Now, Elisha's last assignment is to anoint Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha gives him the responsibility to destroy the house of Ahab in 2 Kings 9 and 10. Jehu does this systematically and brutally. Here are his victims: Jehoram, king of Israel; Ahaziah, king of Judah; Jezebel, Ahab's 70 sons, the relatives of King Hazael of Judah, any remaining survivors of Ahab's family in Samaria. And then he lures all the prophets of Baal into a temple for a religious ceremony, and he executes every prophet of Baal in the temple. What he does is they get in there and he blocks the doors. They can't get out, and he goes with a sword and he completely wipes them out. Okay? But though he eliminates Baal from Israel, he doesn't eliminate Jeroboam from his own heart, according to 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 29 through 31. All right, so he gets rid of Baal, but he keeps Jeroboam's sins in his heart. He didn't follow God completely. I want to discuss some life lessons that we can learn from Jehu's mission very, very quickly. God's justice is certain. Jehu was anointed to fulfill God's prophecy against Ahab's family, and it shows that God's judgment may be delayed, but it's always certain. Evil will not go unpunished. Those who oppose God's laws will face consequences. Secondly, God is sovereign over the leaders of a nation. God raises and removes leaders according to his plan. He appointed Jehu to execute his will, showing that he controlled nations and rulers. And we should trust in God's timing. Brother John said this morning, and we can't see it always at work, but God's timing and decisions are perfect and on his timetable. Third of all, the danger of idolatry. Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel, but he did not take away the idols that Jeroboam had set up. We must remove idols to remain faithful to God. 4, partial obedience is still obedience. Jehu obeyed God in eliminating Baal worship, but he didn't remove the golden calves of Jeroboam, as I just mentioned. God desires complete obedience, not selective faithfulness. You don't get to decide, well, I'm going to take down these idols, but I'm going to leave these up. And God, I gave you this part of my life, but you don't touch this part of my life. And God, I'll surrender to you over here, but over here, this is off limits to you. You don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. 5, God rewards faithfulness, but he expects continued obedience. And number 6, the consequences of a corrupt legacy. Despite Jehu's reform, his descendants did not fully follow God, and Israel suffered for it. And this reminds us to establish a strong, godly foundation for future generations. I'll close with these 2 verses. Galatians 6, 7, and 8. For God, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. He that sows to his flesh shall of his flesh reap corruption, but he that sows to the Spirit shall reap life everlasting. I challenge you this afternoon, do what's right. If you do, God will bless you, and you'll have a joyful judgment. But if you don't do what God commands, you'll be taking your life and your judgment into your own hands, and that never works out for the good. Do what's right. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, you'll also reap. Thank you all for coming.